few weeks ago now, I went out on a little bit of a limb and put out a video on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And specifically, while everyone else was talking about the tactics and the operations that were unfolding, what I wanted to examine was the fact that Russian military investments didn't align with what they were trying to achieve in Ukraine, and perhaps that had some explanatory power for it to help us understand what we were seeing in the Ukraine conflict at that time, and I think still now. I have been overwhelmed by the response to that video, and it seems like some people have taken some valuable lessons out of it. So as a result, I do want to work on a couple of more of them to explore some of the detailed lessons that we seem to see emerging from the Ukraine conflict, in terms of the use of drones, in terms of the use of reservists and irregular forces, and what those might mean for other nations in different contexts. But given the poor quality of information and the importance of sifting through it and being confident in what we say rather than just pushing misinformation into the ether, those videos take a little bit of time. What takes a little bit of less time to do, however, is to address some of the memes and misconceptions that even almost a month into this invasion continue to circulate, even in the media, and frustrate me and others to no end. And they are significant, because they shape public perceptions, they shape politics, they shape the way people expect this conflict will develop, and as a result, how they want to engage with it. And the biggest one, the one that has been around since day one that I want to address quickly today, is the idea that for some reason, the Russians haven't been performing poorly in Ukraine. They haven't been sending their best troops in. What they have instead done is sent forward conscripts and inferior equipment in order to act as cannon fodder, wear out the Ukrainians, only to later unleash their forces at some later point in time. This, almost a month into the conflict, is a myth that just won't die. Now, it's sort of understandable that this myth has risen up. In war, rumours rise to fill gaps in knowledge. So in the first days or weeks of the invasion, a lot of people were really surprised about how it was unfolding, and we went and people look for explanations for what they're seeing. People who believed Russia was a military superpower easily capable of crushing Ukraine looked for simple answers to explain why were they seeing hungry and confused Russian conscripts and seemingly poorly maintained equipment on their news feeds and on social media. And the explanation that people came up with, well, there were many of them, some just denied that Russia wasn't doing particularly well, and there's still some of that going on. But one of the most popular explanations that rose out was that actually the Russians weren't even trying. This is one of a host of ideas that has risen up to try and explain what is happening. I have my own thoughts on most of those. Some of them are more credible than others, but the one I want to deal with is one that I know is not credible from a numerical perspective, and that's the idea that the Russians are fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. So, what's the idea? What's the meme? What's the rumor? And I thought that this would be dead by now, but I realized when talking to some generally quite educated friends, just not people who operate in the geopolitical sphere often, that this meme, this idea, is still extremely alive and well. In an attempt to explain apparent poor Russian performance, as opposed to those who just reject the premise entirely and say Russia is doing really well, these individuals who subscribe to this belief still hold to the idea that Russia is a first-rate army, a major military superpower, and easily capable of winning this conflict. However, they contend that they aren't sending their good stuff in first. The way this usually takes place is they'll put up photos of, like what you see there, some pro-Russian individuals, I believe those are in Donetsk or Luhansk, using a Mosin Nagant rifle, something that was designed in the late 1800s and iterated through the First and Second World War, so ancient technology, or a really old Russian tank, or these tired and confused conscripts, and they'll contend that that is proof, essentially, that the Russian army is holding back its best. At the same time, they'll argue the apparent lack of influence that the VVS, the Russian Air Force, has had on the conflict to date, has been out of restraint rather than a lack of capability, that they haven't put their best foot forward. So the idea is basically this: Russia isn't sending their best equipment, they aren't sending their best troops, and as a result, expect Russia to really pick up the pace to turn this conflict around once the real stuff, in inverted commas, goes in and shows the Ukrainians what's what. Now, there's problems with this idea at a principled level, like how cynical would a government have to be to deliberately send conscripts in first to catch bullets and then send the good troops in after them. At the same time, doesn't this essentially mean that at this one point of the operation that you have surprise, strategic and operational surprise, that you're sending in a whole bunch of units with limited initiative and limited offensive capabilities, and without the ability to exploit? It doesn't make much military sense, it doesn't make much political sense, but I'm going to leave the defense of those principles to other people. I like numbers, I like evidence, and that's what I want to talk about today. So how do we test that idea? The first thing to say is that this has been a social media war. Visual evidence is everywhere. It's chaotic, it's posted all over the internet, it's collected by millions of people with their cell phones, by satellite images, by press agencies, but as I said, mostly by ordinary individuals with cameras, be they soldiers or civilians. And that means that we have perhaps more visual information and evidence on this conflict than perhaps any before it. So for the purpose of assessing what Russian equipment is actually in Ukraine and what Russia has put forward, I'm going to skip Ukrainian claims, I'm going to skip American estimates, I'm going to skip Russian claims. The Russian Federation's Defense Ministry claims that they have shot down more TB2 drones than Ukraine has in inventory. The Ukrainian estimates at the same time, I don't see a reason to take them at face value. Overestimating enemy casualties is a time-honored tradition, and also a very understandable time-honored tradition of just about every official news source during war. So what I'm going to limit myself to are visually verified equipment losses. There is a website link there maintained by a group of individuals on the internet, where what they do is they compile images of equipment losses in Ukraine. They attempt to make sure they're not dealing with duplicates by identifying individual vehicles, geolocating circumstances, and then they track those losses and post the photos so that if you are not sure whether or not to trust the loss or not, you can look at the image and judge for yourself. And in some cases, I have. Now, this doesn't necessarily provide a reliable picture of what the total losses on both sides of the conflict have been. For example, it is if the website is run by people, and it is run by people who generally have quite a pro-Ukraine slant, it is possible, although I don't think this is the case, it is possible that they may be disincentivized from posting all of the evidence of Ukrainian losses they have. They do post Ukrainian losses, but they may be disincentivized from doing so. So we can't go in and just trust that those numbers are accurate. They're also probably not good estimates of maximal losses, because it boggles the mind to suggest that every single vehicle lost in Ukraine will have a photograph of it, taken of it, uploaded, and then be collected by these open source intelligence analysts. That seems incredibly unlikely. What it does provide is a reliable sample and also a fairly strong floor on the number of losses. If something is a visually confirmed equipment loss, it's probably a loss that happened. A very high confidence that that loss indeed happened. So we have a sample of data of things that we're pretty confident Russia has actually lost in Ukraine. One way that you can test this information yourself, if you really want to, for example, is I would recommend picking a piece of equipment which wasn't in Ukrainian inventory, so only in Russian inventory. Pick a tank that wasn't in service with the Ukrainians, for example. That way you can be convinced that they're not misidentifying Ukrainians as Russians and vice versa. Look at the individual images and judge for yourself. Take a sample, verify it, see if in your view there's misidentification happening. I did it with a couple of particularly recognizable platforms. I'm generally happy with the sample of the data I reviewed, so I use it today. So once we look at that loss data, 1,600 pieces of Russian equipment over the course of the invasion to date, thereabouts, about 400 Ukrainian pieces of equipment over the course of the invasion, what do we see with relation to the myth? Because let's remember, if the hypothesis is true that Russia is sending its garbage in first, there should be an awful lot of garbage on that destroyed list, which is exactly not what we see. They're not sending in their old tanks. It certainly doesn't seem like they're sending in their old tanks. There have been 62, at the time that I checked the data, there have been 62 T-72B3 Obrozets 2016. So this is the 2016 modernization of the T-72B3, first operation I think in 2017. A pretty modern tank by most respects, certainly by the standards of the Russian inventory. And it is the most destroyed, captured, or abandoned piece of armor, of tank armor on the Russian side of the roster. I use tanks because they're recognizable. People like tanks. And also there's great discrepancies between the combat capabilities of like the best tanks in inventory and the relatively trash ones. Whereas a bus that drives infantry around, aka an APC or whatnot, they can have improvements, but maybe the value of a metal box is just a metal box in low threat zones. So what you would expect if the Russians were completely equipment agnostic, if they were just sending everything in equal proportions, that you would be losing vehicles roughly in proportion to the numbers the Russians have in inventory. If a vehicle makes up 10% of their active tanks and they send in all their tanks, then they should lose around 10% of those tanks if there's no quality difference. In fact, you should probably assume that if the tanks are better, all else being equal, they should be underrepresented in the total casualty loss counts. Because the B3 has a relatively good ERA protection relative to some of the older vehicles that are in inventory, maybe they suffer fewer losses compared to others. About a quarter of T-72s in Russian inventory, as I understand it, are B3 Obrezets 2016, but 42% of confirmed T-72 losses are OBR 2016s to date. So they're massively overrepresented in the casualties to date. We're not seeing as many of the older T-72 models among the vehicles that are active. We're seeing mostly newer stuff. T-80s, T-90s, these make up 29, 30% of the active tank inventory. They make up 38% of confirmed losses at times of writing. Total identifiable tank losses. I extract out of that sample when calculating these percentages tanks where the model is not clear because the vehicle has been completely freaking pulverized and no one can tell what it was. So the modern T-72s are overrepresented. The T-80s, the T-90s are overrepresented. We've even seen some really cool rare stuff like the T-80U UM2, which was like a 1 or 2 off prototype model, has made an appearance in the loss statistics in Ukraine. So if anything, when you look at tanks, losses are very heavily slanted towards better equipment, not crap. And you see the same things in other system categories. Amongst the BMPs, you've got BMP-2s, older Soviet era APC, which outnumbers the more modern BMP-3 by somewhere between 4 and 5 in active service. But you've lost 30 BMP-3s and 80 BMP-2s visually confirmed, which is actually a higher than proportional loss rate for the BMP-3. If you look at the surface-to-air missiles, it's heavily slanted towards relatively modern systems. There's something, you've got Pantsirs being lost, modernized Bucks, modernized Tors, and some non-modernized ones as well, but certainly a lot of post-Soviet equipment. It's not like they've rolled the Shilkas out of storage and had them all stolen by Ukrainian farmers. It's pretty top-tier stuff. It's $15, $20, $25 million anti-aircraft systems that are being lost in Ukraine. We've seen comm vehicles, jammers, radars, all sorts of specialized equipment. So it certainly seems as if on the ground, the Russians are rolling out their best equipment. And they're rolling it out in significant numbers and losing it in significant numbers. Now, there's a couple of reasons that could be the case in terms of those losses. There are a couple of hypotheses we can draw here, but it certainly seems to put paid to the idea that the Russians are putting out legions and legions of junk because the junk's not being destroyed, which leaves us with two possibilities. Either the junk is actually super weapons, like the T-72A is actually invulnerable from Javelin missiles, and that's why they're not losing any, or they are leaning very heavily on the more modern equipment and sending units with the more modern equipment into the harder fighting. The Air Force is also having a very bad time of it. They're losing aircraft, they've lost helicopters in significant numbers, and what they're losing is not like Soviet-era trash. The aircraft that we're seeing lost, a lot of them entered service quite recently, especially when you look at by the standards of a lot of Western aircraft when they entered service. Su-34 entered service 2014, Su-30 SM first flew 2012, the Kar-52, the Alligators, they went into production, serial production in the 2000s. Now, yes, a lot of these are older airframes, like the Kar-52 airframe goes way back, the Su-30 airframe goes way back, but in these modernized current serial production versions, they're quite modern. The helicopter force of the Russian Air Force generally slants to be quite modern, but it's not like we're seeing a bunch of Mi-24s from like the Dreg units roll out. We're seeing the close air support runs being done by Kar-52s. we're not seeing the older stuff in large numbers. I think we've got 2 Mi-24V/P attack helicopters are on that list, as compared to 6 Kar-52s. So other than the Su-57, the famous Su-57, what are we really seeing missing? What are they apparently holding back from this list? We haven't seen any strategic bombers lost, but we know they're being used to launch standoff munitions. So we don't expect them to be lost, but we know they're being used. What I ask people who genuinely believe this myth, do you believe is not being utilized, is not being deployed? Now, I accept that there has been some real trash deployed, like definitely some bottom of the barrel, absolute trash deployed by Russian forces. We've seen armored trains that would not have been out of place on the Eastern Front in World War II. We've seen some, that's not even the worst T-72 I found. I found a naked T-72, no ERO plates, as opposed to this sort of DIY kit where they've got the late applique ERA plates, those little blocks of explosive reactive armor that you can see on the vehicle. But you're still looking at some mid-Cold War, like 1970s, 1980s at best, versions of some of these tanks rolled out. You are seeing people in Donetsk and Luhansk, the pro-Russian separatist forces there, use some real junk. But overall, if you take the emotion out of it and look at what data we have available to us, it certainly seems like losses slant very heavily towards newer systems. Now, I'm not contending that that's ironclad evidence. It is hypothetically possible that all the T-72A drivers out there just happen to be Kolobanov reincarnated, people who go 16-0 on World of Tanks or whatever, and somehow they're dodging every ATGM out there. Meanwhile, all of the modern stuff is being driven by idiots. It's hypothetically possible, but it seems incredibly unlikely. And we can probably conclude with some confidence that the Russians have more or less done what you'd expect of a major power going into a military operation. They've sent their more ready, their more capable, and their better equipped units first, and because those units have gone in first, they have suffered a disproportionate share of the casualties in the subsequent fighting. So far as the actual units themselves, because this is the second part of the myth. The first part of the myth is they're not sending their good equipment in. The second part, which I always found harder to understand, is that the Russians aren't sending good troops in. This is where you see, oh no, they're just conscripts. This one I find a little bit harder to understand because the evidence against it is pretty overwhelming, and I felt it was overwhelming from day one. In particularly because we saw so many damn airborne operations in the opening week of the campaign. There were Vedev landings repeatedly, very well publicized. You had CNN reporters on location when there were Vedev guys present at Hostomel Airport. That fighting was very well publicized. You've also seen vehicle types from the start that are only associated with top tier units being photographed and imaged and uploaded as present in Ukraine and also lost in Ukraine. The BMD-4s, the airborne vehicles, the BMDs, weren't suddenly, or it seems very unlikely that they were suddenly given to conscript infantry units who drove them into Ukraine and died. We saw airborne operations, Spetsnaz operations being done from day one. And those guys are about as far away from conscripts as you can get in the Russian military. Units that are entirely made up of contractors and professional soldiers are special in the Russian military because it has that hybrid conscript professional service model. So if you see units that are fully professional, like the Vedev going in, that's a signal that they're committing some pretty significant forces, units that have significant combat value relative to perhaps the less reliable conscript-filled units. So again, it's not impossible. It's possible that the Russians just stuck a bunch of conscripts in VDV uniforms and told them, hey, Ivan, you're doing air assault duty on Hostomel Airport, and you're going to go catch a bunch of SAMs and it's going to be fine. It's possible that they did that, but it just seems extremely unlikely. The Occam's razor, the best evidence we have is that the guys doing air assault duty were the air assault specialists. It was the airborne troops. That the guys doing special operations and advanced operations were the Spetsnaz guys. That it was not nobodies driving those Tiger M vehicles. It was professional troops on a mission doing thunder runs down roads in order to try and secure critical locations in the early days of the war. So The evidence suggests, and I'm open to competing evidence, that the Russians committed some of their best troops from day one and continue to do so, because we continue to see BMD losses, specialist equipment losses of equipment associated with those specialized units. And also, if you're only going to send conscripts in, then you'd expect to mostly be conscripts dying, but there's been a disproportionate number of senior Russian officers claimed killed or confirmed killed over the course of this conflict. Like, by the standards of modern war, an exceptionally high number. I've got a number of them identified there. We've got 7th VDV, 29th Combined Arms Army, 150th Motor Rifle. But in particular, there we are, Andrei Sukovetsky, 7th VDV. Well, how was he killed if they're not even deploying the VDV into action? That seems highly unlikely. So it's not just like the Russians are filling ditches with conscripts. It seems to be that they're sending in quality units, and then when the command and control of those units begins to break down, that the generals and the commanding officers are going forward in order to try and establish command and control again and getting themselves killed. That's the best thesis I can come up with in order to explain why we're seeing those officers die. But it's certainly not in keeping with the idea of some conscript human wave Ura charge intended to soak up machine gun bullets. It's not consistent with that. It's consistent with an army trying to maintain control and doing everything it can in order to get the initiative back. That's when you send your generals forward and into fire. So what can we take from this? And I intended this one to be a pretty quick one to deal with this myth. It's not that Russia is just throwing just good stuff into the fight, but they're also not throwing only junk. We've seen some junk. We've seen some more modern stuff. There's a spectrum at play. The loss figures, however, slant to the modern. Now, there's a couple of explanations for that, and it can be a combination of factors. It can be that they've deployed more of the modern equipment, relatively speaking, compared to the older stuff. It could be that the sort of units allocated to the invasion had better equipment in general. And that was certainly, Western analysts certainly seem to believe that was in the case in relation to a number of the units that were employed. It could also indicate that the better units with the better equipment are the ones that are being leaned on more heavily for heavy-duty fighting. And as a result, they're taking disproportionate losses. The modern stuff we can also see clearly isn't invulnerable. We have visual evidence of things being destroyed by anti-tank missiles. We have visual evidence of casualties to mines. But we have lots and lots and lots of evidence of things running out of gas or being abandoned and then being set on fire or captured or towed away by John Deere tractors. So clearly the modern stuff is not invulnerable. It runs out of gas just as much as something made in the 1980s, which is one of the critical findings we're drawing out of this conflict so far. I would, however, warn us all against taking too many conclusions from this. Like I said, there's still some uncertainty around what the cause of that discrepancy is. And again, our visually confirmed losses are just a soft floor on how many things have actually been lost. It may be that the actual sample is larger and there's a lot more junk represented, we just haven't seen it photographed. That's statistically unlikely, but it is possible. What I do think we have enough to do, however, is to say that this meme should die, this idea should die. Russia is throwing, in terms of its ground warfare technology and its air force, is throwing just about everything it's got into this. It's a significant portion of Russia's combat-ready battalion tactical groups have gone into Ukraine, and they represent some of the best and most modern deployed equipment that the Russians have available to them. There are a few very modern pieces of equipment that we have not seen yet. We'll just have to keep our eyes out, but we have questions over how much of that stuff is deployed anyway. The final point I want to raise is, in a conflict where public perception matters, even dumb memes like this or ideas like this really do matter. I'm not suggesting that everyone who believes this meme is dumb, far from it. They might just not have access to all the information. The idea may be wrong, but the people behind it aren't necessarily dumb. They may just be misinformed. But it has a serious effect on how people perceive the conflict. If you believe, for example, that Russia any day now could take its hand out from behind its back and just conventionally smash Ukraine back to its western borders in a matter of days, and it's just been holding back, then the sort of aid you recommend and the stance you're going to take on the conflict, the stance you're going to take on Russia is going to be very different than if you have the view that Ukraine, with Western support, is probably able to continue to stymie the Russian advance. That the Russian offensive may have culminated and may be facing serious difficulties. And there aren't a huge amount of magical capabilities that the Russians can pull out at any moment. If you are a more neutral power and you're looking at this and you're considering Russia as a military ally, then believing that this wasn't a proper representation of what the Russian army can do, at least equipment-wise, might have a very significant impact on your views and thus what you push your politicians to do. Like I said, I don't subscribe to the view that we have enough evidence yet to make holistic judgments over the quality of every aspect of the Russian army. But what I am confident enough to say is that we have more than enough data to point out that from an equipment perspective, from a units committed perspective, the Russians are trying, and they're trying hard. Anyway, thanks for bearing with me tonight. I hope that video was useful for some of you. I'm not sure if many of you still held that view, but I'm sure all of you will have encountered people or media outlets that still do and still push this narrative, so I hope it's valuable to some of you. I should be back in the near future. I'm looking at the very frightening use of drones and less expensive weapon systems and micro weapon systems in Ukraine, but from my slant of what does that mean for defense sector investment and the planning that nations are going to have to do going forward, as opposed to the tactical dimensions of their use. I'm also looking at the national lessons that I think need to be taken out of the use of territorial defense and irregular forces in Ukraine, how nations may need to adjust some of their thinking, and also some of the lessons and opportunities that can derive from that, what Ukraine could have done better, what other nations might do better. And I'm going to put all of those in historical context because reservist systems and the use of irregulars is a tale as old as time. And as well as taking account of modern conflicts, we should also take lessons from the past before we commit our nations to massive investments or structuring our entire defense plans. Anyway, that's all from me for now. My best wishes to all people in Ukraine or all people pushed out of Ukraine and displaced internally or externally by the ongoing conflict. Our thoughts are with you. And if you are listening and you're in a position to do anything about the ongoing humanitarian crisis, I would encourage you to do exactly that. I don't monetize these videos because I don't want to make a cent off this stuff, not while there's a real war going on. But if you are inclined, or you would be inclined to support me for doing stuff like this for the moment, then please find a worthy cause helping the people affected and help that instead. I'll be back soon, guys. Best wishes to you all.